I knew something was off. The second Justin Miller swaggered into my cubicle like he had just been handpicked by a tech titan. Fresh out of university, with a smug grin, he sat in the guest chair, crossed his legs, and said he was here to shadow me. Shadowing was a polite term. Brad Thorne, our operations manager at Apex Ledger Solutions, had cornered me in the break room that morning. Brad smelled of cheap cologne and bad intentions. He had patted my shoulder and told me we needed redundancy in case I ever decided to take a vacation. I was 48 years old, and I had not taken a single sick day or vacation day in 4 years. I had worked through ear infections and family emergencies because payroll and financial systems do not stop for personal crises. I knew the redundancy line was a lie. Justin was not here to learn, he was here to replace me. Justin was 24, armed with a degree in business administration and an unearned sense of superiority. He immediately began commenting on my workflows. He saw me running a macro and remarked on the outdated database tables I was querying. He did not know that I had personally automated 90% of our reconciliation process to keep the department running after Brad laid off half the staff last year. Justin typed on his laptop with rapid keystrokes, asking questions that sounded like textbook summaries. Meanwhile, Brad kept hovering in the hallway, popping in to ask if we had granted Justin full administrative access to our vendor accounts. I told Brad that read-only access was standard protocol for onboarding. Brad frowned, suggesting we speed up the integration since Justin would need full privileges soon anyway. I kept my face blank and refused to click the approval button. Over the next few days, I watched Justin closely. He was eager to impress, and he knew where our vendor templates were stored before I even showed him. He was asking questions about our legacy database access codes from 2020. I noticed Brad was tracking our login times on our internal systems. Brad believed he was running a stealth operation. He did not realize that I had designed the network architecture at Apex Ledger Solutions 15 years ago. Every log, every access request, and every digital footprint was recorded on a secure ledger that only my root account could access. Justin tried to build rapport by praising Brad's leadership style. I stayed quiet. Brad once printed out a screenshot of a spreadsheet and asked me how to copy the cells onto a thumb drive. He was not a technical genius, but he was excellent at claiming credit for other people's labor. I smiled, explained the database queries to Justin, and pointed out the security protocols. I kept teaching him, detailing the approval flows and audit requirements. I let Brad believe his plan was working, but I was already shifting my strategy. I had spent my entire adult life managing data. I knew that the only way to beat a dishonest manager was with cold, hard facts. If Brad wanted to replace me with a cheaper, younger model to cover up his own inefficiencies, I would let him try. I would give him all the rope he needed. For 3 days, Justin sat beside me, typing loudly on his keyboard and making notes in a leather notebook he had placed prominently on the desk. He asked me about the database triggers that routed the end-of-month payroll to our clearing bank. I explained the basic logic, but kept the specific cryptographic verification codes to myself. Justin nodded like he understood, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He was out of his depth, but his arrogance prevented him from admitting it. Brad would walk by every hour, offering Justin words of encouragement while ignoring my presence. It was a classic corporate freeze-out designed to make me feel isolated and obsolete. I did not care. I had seen managers like Brad come and go. They relied on buzzwords and charisma, while people like me kept the servers running and the audits clean. I logged into my console and created a separate, isolated sandbox environment for Justin. Every database change he attempted, every query he ran, and every permission change he requested would be executed within this sandbox. To Justin and Brad, it would look like he had full administrative access. In reality, he was playing in a digital backyard, while my root account monitored his every move. I set up automated email triggers that would forward any modifications to my private mailbox. If Brad tried to use Justin's account to alter records, I would know within seconds. I was ready. To make things even clearer, Justin spent his afternoons lecturing me on modern cloud computing and agile methodology. He would talk about how legacy payroll systems were a liability and how a modern organization needed dynamic, cloud-based ledgers that could be updated on the fly. I listened to him talk, sipping my black coffee, while remembering how many times the cloud services he praised had experienced outages during critical Q4 processing windows. I did not explain to him that our local servers were mirrored across 3 geographical zones with automatic failovers that I had personally written in raw bash script. I did not mention that the security hash keys we used were rotated hourly. I let him believe I was just an old accountant who only understood desktop spreadsheets. He even tried to teach me pivot tables, unaware I had written the backend API's compilation code. I watched him struggle with basic SQL syntax, helping him quietly when he got stuck. I needed him to look competent enough to give Brad the confidence to make his move. I wanted them both to feel secure. The upscale restaurant Brad Thorne chose for our quarterly lunch was a minimalist establishment with bonsai trees by the windows. It was exactly the kind of place Brad selected when he wanted to project culture to our CEO, Mr. Kenzo Sato. Brad had spent the entire morning rehearsing phrases on his phone, trying to make himself look worldly. I arrived 10 minutes early because I like to observe the room before a difficult meeting. Mr. Sato arrived shortly after, looking sharp in a tailored suit, accompanied by his assistant Naomi Tanaka. Naomi was delayed by a flight cancellation and would not arrive until later. This left Brad alone to translate for Mr. Sato, an opportunity he clearly relished. We ordered, and Brad immediately ordered steak, laughing loudly at his own jokes. He spoke to Mr. Sato in broken, elementary Japanese, nodding vigorously to show enthusiasm. I sat quietly, drinking green tea and reviewing the menu options. I ordered a simple bento box, while Brad went out of his way to order the most expensive sashimi platters, clearly charging it to the corporate expense account. Mr. Sato noticed this minor detail, his eyes tracking the excess, though he said nothing. Somewhere between the main course and his third drink, Brad leaned closer to Mr. Sato. He gestured toward me, smiled warmly, and spoke in Japanese. He told Mr. Sato that I was an old-fashioned administrator who had hit my ceiling. He said I would be phased out by the next quarter and that the young talent Justin was already prepared to take over. Brad looked at me as he spoke, his eyes filled with arrogance, confident that his words were nothing but noise to me. What Brad did not know was that I had spent 5 years in Tokyo. I had completed my master's degree in financial systems at the University of Tokyo, living in a small apartment and studying corporate tax codes in kanji. I had audited municipal accounting systems in Japan before Brad had even entered management. I understood every syllable he spoke. I felt a cold wave of clarity settle in my spine. I did not frown, and I did not interrupt. I took a slow sip of my tea, looked Brad in the eye, and smiled. I let him continue his presentation. He showed Mr. Sato a printout of the efficiency reports I had written, with his own name placed at the top. I noticed Mr. Sato's expression was polite but detached. He was not impressed by Brad's performance, but he was too polite to show it. When lunch ended, Brad slapped me on the shoulder, laughing about the complex language barrier. I told him it was an educational experience. He missed the quiet confidence in my voice. As I walked back to the office through the rain, I knew my time as his loyal administrator was over. I was going to use my skills to dismantle his position. I was going to do it quietly, using the very systems I had built. The rain was cold, but my mind was entirely clear. Brad had made the mistake of assuming my silence was a sign of ignorance. He believed that because I did not brag about my achievements or seek the spotlight, I was powerless. He was wrong. In my 5 years in Tokyo, I had learned that the most effective strategy is one that is executed without noise. I recalled the specific Japanese phrases Brad had used. He had said, "Kanojo wa choto furukusai. Tsugi no shienki made ni wa inaku naru desho." He had actually referred to me using the feminine pronoun kanojo because he had copied the phrase from a translator app without realizing it was gender-specific. It was a hilarious error, showing his complete lack of attention to detail, but it also confirmed his intent. He wanted me gone. He was telling the CEO that I was obsolete, a manual worker in an automated age, and had assured him that my department would run much cheaper under his direct supervision, with Justin as his lead analyst. It was a complete misrepresentation of the work I had done. I had spent 15 years building and refining the financial architecture of Apex Ledger Solutions. I knew the locations of every ledger, the security protocols of every bank transfer, and the vulnerabilities of our current systems. More importantly, I knew Brad's weaknesses. He was greedy and he was careless. He believed that because he held a senior management title, his actions were above scrutiny. He did not realize that in the digital space, every action leaves a trace. I returned to my desk, dried my coat, and sat down at my terminal. I opened the master security logs and began a comprehensive audit of all administrative actions taken by Brad Thorne over the past 12 months. It was time to find out what he was trying to hide behind his restructuring plans. I knew that Brad had been pushing for vendor consolidation. He had repeatedly asked me to bypass standard verification protocols for several new service providers. At the time, I had insisted on full documentation, which had visibly irritated him. Now, with the Japanese conversation fresh in my mind, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. He did not just want a cheaper worker. He wanted someone who would not ask questions when he authorized suspicious payments. He wanted an administrator who lacked the experience to spot irregularities. Justin was perfect for that role. He was young, eager to please, and knew nothing about forensic auditing. I locked my screen and began to write my first SQL queries of the investigation. I spent the weekend at my desk, pulling data from our secure backup servers. I was not seeking emotional validation. I wanted objective proof. I opened my personal terminal and logged into the primary databases, pulling up Brad Thorne's administrative activity logs. Since I had designed the override protocols, I knew exactly where to look. The first anomaly appeared in the Q4 bonus logs. Brad had received a $40,000 adjustment 4 days after the fiscal year had closed. The authorization code matched my personal administrative login, but the timestamp was registered at a time I was out of the office. I pulled the network logs and verified that the transaction had been executed from Brad's office terminal. He had used a master recovery key to bypass the standard approval workflow. This was a clear violation of California Penal Code Section 470, which governs forgery. Because the authorization was executed without my consent, the electronic signature was falsified, rendering the transaction void ab initio under standard corporate compliance. In corporate law, a transaction that is void ab initio is treated as if it never existed, meaning the funds were taken without legal authority. This was a critical distinction that would prevent Brad from arguing that it was a retroactive adjustment. I did not stop there. I reviewed the vendor ledger for the past 2 fiscal years. I found 12 payments totaling $85,000 made to a consulting group called North Star Advising. I checked our corporate directory and found no contract, no deliverables, and no tax documentation for this entity. I ran a public search on the business registry and discovered that North Star Advising was registered to a residential address that belonged to Brad's brother-in-law. This was a direct breach of fiduciary duty, specifically the duty of loyalty and the prohibition against self-dealing under state corporate statutes. As an officer of Apex Ledger Solutions, Brad had a strict duty to act in the best interests of the corporation. Routing money to a relative's shell company without board disclosure was a textbook violation. I compiled the evidence into a spreadsheet, linking every unauthorized transaction to its network timestamp and terminal ID. I did not go to human resources. I knew that local HR was there to protect the company from liability, which often meant silencing the whistleblower. Instead, I searched my archives for Naomi Tanaka's direct email address. I drafted a message in formal Japanese. I wrote that I had identified recurring compliance issues regarding vendor disbursements and administrative overrides. I kept the message professional, attaching a single redacted PDF showing the unauthorized bonus adjustments. I sent the email and waited. 3 hours later, Naomi replied. Her response was brief and polite. She asked if I possessed the underlying database logs. I replied that I had the complete metadata trails. We agreed to meet via secure video link 2 nights later. I knew I had found the correct path. I spent the intervening time verifying every single data point. I pulled the database schemas, the server configuration logs, and the individual transaction hashes. I wanted to ensure that there was no room for interpretation. Brad had committed financial fraud, and he had done so by forging my digital signature. Under California law, A forged document is invalid from its inception, meaning the entire transaction is legally void. This was the key. By proving the forgery, I would not only expose Brad's theft, but I would also demonstrate that the financial reports he had presented to the CEO were based on falsified records. I organized the data into a logical sequence, creating a clear narrative of embezzlement and system manipulation. I knew that when the board saw the technical proof, they would have no choice but to act. They could not ignore a clear violation of state law that exposed the corporation to regulatory penalties. I saved the files to an encrypted folder on my private server, ready for the presentation. I also discovered that the payments to North Star Advising had been categorized as software maintenance fees. This was a clever trick, as maintenance fees below $10,000 did not require board approval under our old bylaws. However, Brad had forgotten that I had updated the financial policy controls last year. Under the revised guidelines, any recurring payment to a single vendor that exceeded $20,000 in aggregate over a 12-month period triggered an automatic internal audit flag. Brad had bypassed this flag by manually clearing the alerts using my administrative credential. Each time he cleared an alert, the system recorded the action, along with the IP address of his office computer. I matched the timestamps of these cleared alerts with the building access logs. On 3 of the dates in question, Brad was the only person logged into the physical building, according to the security gate records. He had physically swiped his card at the entrance, walked to his office, and cleared the audit alerts using my credentials. The correlation was absolute. There was no possibility of a remote hacker or an administrative mistake. It was a deliberate manual intervention by Brad Thorne to cover up his own unauthorized transfers. I added the building access logs and physical gate times to my final report sealing the case. I also traced the bank routing numbers for North Star Advising. The funds had been transferred to a local credit union branch, straight into a joint account owned by Brad and his brother-in-law. Our video meeting took place at midnight my time, which was afternoon in Tokyo. Naomi Tanaka was sitting in a quiet conference room, the city skyline visible behind her. I did not present an emotional argument. I shared my screen and walked her through the raw database records. I showed her the falsified administrative signatures, the duplicate transaction hashes, and the payments routed to the unregistered consulting firm. Naomi took notes, her expression serious. She was a professional who understood corporate compliance. She did not ask about my feelings. She asked for the raw database exports and the network validation logs. I told her I would provide the full package, complete with Japanese translations for the technical summaries. Naomi explained that Tokyo was already suspicious of the rising administrative expenses in our branch. The board had been questioning the high fees paid to external consultants, but Brad had always defended them as necessary software upgrades. However, without technical proof, they could not bypass the local executive board to terminate Brad's contract. The data I was presenting was the key they needed to trigger the immediate breach of contract clause. This clause would not only allow for his termination, but would also nullify his severance package and expose him to corporate litigation. I agreed to package the database logs alongside a detailed explanatory memorandum in both English and Japanese. Over the next 10 days, I functioned as a double agent in my own department. I continued to train Justin Miller, showing him how to run basic reconciliations. I also quietly restricted his system access, routing all of his actions through a monitoring sandbox I had constructed. Justin was completely unaware. He was busy sending status updates to Brad, claiming he had mastered the systems. I monitored Justin's accounts and saw that he was attempting to delete historical audit trails from the 2022 payroll logs. This was done under Brad's login credentials. I logged these deletion attempts, capturing the IP addresses and the terminal IDs. Brad believed he was erasing his tracks. In reality, he was creating a digital trail of obstruction. To keep the sandbox completely undetected, I had written custom API wrappers that simulated database latency. When Justin ran a eSQL delete query, the interface showed a standard confirmation message and fake database statistics. Justin believed the records were gone. In reality, the query had bypassed the live tables completely and was recorded in an isolated audit log folder that I controlled. I watched his IP address execute these commands night after night. Logging each instance, on Thursday afternoon, Brad sent a meeting invite for the following Monday. The subject was Q4 operational alignment. The attachment listed the payroll restructuring plan. My name was listed at the bottom under the heading for transition candidates. Justin was listed as the new manager of financial reconciliation. Brad walked by my desk and smiled, saying he was looking forward to the future of the department. I smiled back and told him I was prepared. I spent the rest of the day finalizing the audit file. I sent the complete encrypted folder to Naomi Tanaka, along with the logs showing the recent deletion attempts. The trap was set, and the documentation was irrefutable. I knew that Brad was confident. He believed that his plan to replace me was almost complete, and that once I was gone, any discrepancies in the records would be buried under the new management team. He did not know that Naomi Tanaka had already briefed the board of directors in Tokyo, and that they had authorized a formal internal investigation. The files I had sent were being reviewed by the Global Audit Committee. I spent the weekend away from my computer, walking in the park and enjoying the quiet. I had done the work, and the systems I had designed were performing exactly as intended. I had built those networks to resist external intrusion, but I had also built them to record internal betrayal. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office early. I wore my best suit and took my place in the boardroom. I was ready to watch the system do its job. I had spent 15 years protecting this company's financial data, and I was not about to let a corrupt manager destroy my reputation. I sat at the table and opened my tablet, checking the system logs one last time. The sandbox was still running, and the logs showed that Justin had attempted to access the historical archives again at 8 o'clock that morning. He was trying to verify that the deletions had been successful. He did not know that the records he saw in the sandbox were simulated, and that the original, unmodified audit logs were already in the hands of the board of directors. I watched the other members of the department file into the room. They looked nervous, sensing that a major reorganization was about to take place. Brad was walking around the room, patting people on the back and offering coffee. He looked like a man who believed he had won. Justin stood near him, holding a folder of slides, trying to look like a senior executive. I sat quietly, drinking my tea, and waited for the meeting to begin. I knew that the next hour would change everything. The silence in the room was palpable, the kind of silence that precedes a major corporate realignment. The boardroom was quiet when I walked in on Monday morning. Mr. Sato sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 senior board members. Brad Thorne was standing by the screen, adjusting his tie and checking his slides. Justin Miller sat near him, looking confident. I took a seat in the front row, directly across from Brad. I placed my notebook on the table but did not open it. Brad clicked to his first slide and began his presentation on cost reduction. He spoke about streamlining operations and reducing administrative overhead. Then, he paused and tried to address what he called a minor administrative issue. He said the department had received some anonymous allegations regarding transaction records, but that he was working with local legal counsel to resolve the matter. Mr. Sato raised his hand, cutting him off. Mr. Sato spoke in English, stating that local legal counsel was not handling the matter, but that the executive board was. Naomi Tanaka walked into the room, holding a folder stamped with the seal of the Tokyo headquarters. She handed the documents to Mr. Sato, who opened them and began reviewing the logs. The documents were passed to the other board members. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper. Brad's face went pale. He tried to speak, claiming that any discrepancy was the result of clerical errors made by the legacy staff. He pointed at me, saying that I had authorized the transactions. I did not raise my voice. I stood up, bowed formally to Mr. Sato and the board, and began speaking in fluent, formal Japanese. I explained that the database records showed the overrides were executed from Brad's personal terminal using a falsified signature. I cited California Penal Code Section 470, explaining that the authorizations were void ab initio due to forgery. I pointed out the transaction logs, showing the attempts to delete the records. Brad stared at me, his mouth open, unable to process the fact that I was speaking Japanese. The board members whispered among themselves, looking at the printed reports in front of them. Brad's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He tried to claim that the database logs were fabricated, that I was setting him up, and that he would sue the company for wrongful termination under state law. However, Mr. Sato raised a hand, silencing him. The evidence of forgery and the unauthorized transfers to his brother-in-law's firm was undeniable. Naomi Tanaka confirmed my statements, presenting the metadata logs that showed the IP addresses, tracking back to his office. Mr. Sato looked at Brad and told him his employment was terminated, effective immediately, with all stock options forfeited and no severance package. Two security officers entered the room, stood on either side of Brad, and quietly escorted him out. Justin Miller sat frozen in his chair, his hands trembling. His previous confidence completely evaporated as he realized his career was now in my hands. The other members of the executive board nodded in agreement with my presentation, looking at Brad's empty chair with a mixture of shock and relief. They had survived a major compliance crisis, but only because my systems had kept the records safe. The CEO turned to the board, then looked at me. He announced that I was being promoted to Director of Financial Systems, reporting directly to the Tokyo office. I bowed, gathered my notes, and walked out of the room. I had protected my work, my reputation, and the systems I had built, all through quiet preparation and the power of facts. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and began the process of revoking Brad's access credentials permanently. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had not resorted to shouting or emotional scenes. I had let the integrity of the database and the precision of the law speak for me. My new role would require frequent travel to Tokyo, a city I knew well, and I would be responsible for establishing global compliance protocols across all subsidiaries. As for Justin, his contract was reviewed, and he was placed on strict probation under my direct supervision. He no longer smiled when he saw me. He kept his head down and focused on his work. I opened my terminal, loaded the master administration dashboard, and began drafting the new security guidelines for the company. The office was quiet, and the work went on. I knew that the transition would be difficult, but I was prepared. The systems I had built would now be implemented on a global scale, ensuring that no other manager could exploit the vulnerabilities I had identified. I looked out the window at the city skyline, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from my shoulders. The strategy had worked perfectly. By maintaining my silence and documenting every detail, I had turned a career threat into a global promotion. The board had recognized the value of my technical expertise and my loyalty to the corporation. I opened a new file in my terminal and began writing the first report for the Tokyo Compliance Committee. The title of the document was Global Financial Controls and Security Integration. It was a new chapter for the company, and a new chapter for me. I was ready to begin.